16. Watergate. In the early morning hours of June 17, 1972, Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police, responding to a request for assistance from a security guard, apprehended and arrested 5 men who had illegally entered the headquarters suite of the Democratic National Committee, located in the Watergate Hotel complex. Approximately 3 months later, these individuals and 2 others who had escaped detection at the arrest scene were indicted. These were, as is now known, burglars with an intelligence mission, authorized by some of the most powerful officials in the federal government. Inquiries into this incident by law enforcement and congressional investigators subsequently revealed a most unusual and legally questionable intelligence organization. Sometime in 1970, the White House, concerned in part about increasing domestic protests and acts of violence, as well as recent leakages of national security information embarrassing to the administration, produced a top-secret study entitled Operational Restraints on Intelligence Collection. Authorized by Tom Charles Houston, Assistant Counsel to the President and White House Project Officer on Security Programs, this paper, commonly referred to as the Houston Plan, suggested techniques for making domestic intelligence operations more effective, perhaps to curtail violent protests or to identify those responsible for or otherwise trafficking in leaked national security materials. Among the recommendations offered in the document were increased use of electronic surveillances and penetrations. Existing coverage is grossly inadequate. Mail coverage and surreptitious entries, break-ins. Houston was quite candid about the implications of these undertakings, saying, quote, "Covert mail coverage is illegal, and there are serious risks involved. However, the advantages to be derived from its use outweigh the risks. This technique is particularly valuable in identifying espionage agents and other contacts of foreign intelligence services." End quote. And with regard to break-ins, quote, "Use of this technique is clearly illegal. It amounts to burglary. It is also highly risky and could result in great embarrassment if exposed. However, it is also the most fruitful tool and can produce the type of intelligence which cannot be obtained in any other fashion." End quote. Footnote. The Houston Plan continues to be a highly classified document. Quotations utilized here are extracted from sanitized segments of the paper appearing in U.S. Congress, Senate, Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, Presidential Campaign Activities of 1972, Watergate and Related Activities, Book 3, Hearings, 93rd Congress, First Session, Washington, U.S. Government Print Office, 1973, pages 1319 through 1324. End footnote. When his report was completed, Houston apparently forwarded it for scrutiny by the President. Quote, "On July 14, 1970, White House Chief of Staff H.R. Haldeman sent a top-secret memorandum to Houston, notifying him of the President's approval of the use of burglaries, illegal wiretaps, and illegal mail covers for domestic intelligence." In the memorandum, Haldeman stated, quote, "The recommendations you have proposed as a result of the review have been approved by the President. He does not, however, want to follow the procedure you outlined on page 4 of your memorandum regarding implementation. He would prefer that the thing simply be put into motion on the basis of this approval. The formal official memorandum should, of course, be prepared, and that should be the device by which to carry it out." End quote. It appears that the next day, July 15, 1970, Houston prepared a decision memorandum based on the President's approval for distribution to the federal intelligence agencies involved in the plan: the FBI, the CIA, the National Security Agency, and the Defense Intelligence Agency. In his May 22, 1973 public statement, the President reported that the decision memorandum was circulated to the agencies involved on July 23, 1970. However, the decision memorandum is dated July 15, 1970, indicating that it was forwarded to the agencies on that day or shortly thereafter. Houston's recommendations were opposed by J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI. Hoover had served as the chairman of a group comprised of the heads of the federal intelligence agencies formed to study the problems of intelligence gathering and cooperation among the various intelligence agencies. In his public statement of May 22, 1973, President Nixon stated, quote, "After reconsideration, however, prompted by the opposition of Director Hoover, the agencies were notified 5 days later, on July 28th, that the approval had been rescinded." End quote. Haldeman's testimony before the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities is to the same effect. White House counsel John Dean, however, testified that he was not aware of any rescission of approval for the plan, and there apparently is no written record of a rescission on July 28th or any other date. There is, however, clear evidence that after receipt of the decision memorandum of July 15, 1970, Mr. Hoover did present strong objections concerning the plan to Attorney General Mitchell. End quote. Footnote: U.S. Congress, Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activity. The final report, page 4. End footnote. Houston attempted to counter Hoover's arguments in a memorandum to Haldeman dated August 5th, 8 days after the president allegedly ordered the rescission, in which he indicated that the NSA, DIA, CIA, and the military services basically supported the Houston recommendations. Quote, "Later, on September 18, 1970, almost 2 months after the president claims the plan was rescinded, Dean sent a top-secret memorandum to the Attorney General, suggesting certain procedures to commence our domestic intelligence operation as quickly as possible. This memorandum specifically called for the creation of an interagency domestic intelligence unit, which had been an integral part of the Houston plan. Dean's memorandum to the Attorney General observed that Hoover was strongly opposed to the creation of such a unit and that it was important to bring the FBI fully on board. Far from indicating that the president's approval of Houston's recommendation to remove restraints on illegal intelligence gathering had been withdrawn, Dean, in his memorandum, suggested to the Attorney General, "I believe we agreed that it would be inappropriate to have any blanket removal of restrictions. Rather, the most appropriate procedure would be to decide on the type of intelligence we need based on an assessment of the recommendations of this unit, and then proceed to remove the restraints as necessary to obtain such intelligence." End quote. The Interagency Domestic Intelligence Unit was never realized, and it is difficult to determine if any other recommendation from the Houston Plan was directly implemented. Nevertheless, the document may have functioned as an intellectual stimulant to those high officials subsequently involved in the Watergate scandals. Houston left the White House sometime in 1971 and returned to private law practice in Indianapolis. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, the principal critic and opponent of the Houston Plan, died on May 2, 1972. Out of this background, a number of intelligence organizational developments began to occur in and around the White House. Quote, "In June 1971, the leak of the Pentagon Papers prompted the president to create a special investigations unit, later known as the Plumbers, inside the White House under the direction of Egil Crow. Crow, in turn, was directly supervised by Assistant to the President John Ehrlichman. Crow was soon joined by David Young, and in July, the unit, staffing up for a broader role, added G. Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunt, both known to the White House as persons with investigative experience. Liddy was a former FBI agent, Hunt, a former CIA agent." End quote. Probably the first such White House intelligence component in history, the Special Investigations Unit planned and executed the burglary of the office of Dr. Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist, Dr. Lewis J. Fielding. Liddy, Hunt, and 2 of their Cuban-American recruits later broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate hotel complex. Quote, "The committee to re-elect the president, headed by former Attorney General John Mitchell, and together with the Finance Committee for the re-election of the president, counting some 35 former White House aides among its personnel, was gearing up for its own political intelligence gathering program around the same time as the Ellsberg break-in. In September 1971, John Dean asked former Special Assistant to the President Jeb Stuart Magruder to join him for lunch with Jack Caulfield. Jack Caulfield, a White House investigator who had conducted numerous political investigations, some with former New York City policeman Anthony Ulasewicz, who had conducted investigations for Ehrlichman, wanted to sell Magruder his political intelligence plan, Project Sandwedge, for use by CRP. Magruder had been organizing the campaign effort since May 1971, having received this assignment from Mitchell and Haldeman. In essence, the Sandwedge program proposed a private corporation operating like a Republican Intertel, a private international detective agency, to serve the president's campaign. In addition to normal investigative activities, the Sandwedge plan also included the use of bagmen and other covert intelligence gathering operations. End quote. While Caulfield had proposed Sandwedge to the White House in the spring of 1971 and later had proposed its adoption by the Committee to Re-elect the President, the plan was rejected in both instances. Quote, with Sandwedge rebuffed, Magruder and Gordon Strachan of Haldeman's staff asked Dean to find a lawyer to serve as CRP General Counsel who could also direct an intelligence gathering program. Magruder stated before the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activity that he and Dean had, on previous occasions, discussed the need for such a program with Attorney General Mitchell. The man Dean recruited was G. Gordon Liddy, who moved from the Special Investigations Unit in the White House to CRP. Magruder testified that when Dean sent Liddy to the committee to re-elect the president in 1971, he, Magruder, was unaware of Liddy's activities for the Plumbers, particularly his participation in the break-in of Dr. Fielding's office. End quote. Once in place at CRP headquarters, Liddy's principal efforts were devoted to developing, advocating, and implementing a comprehensive political intelligence gathering program for CRP under the code name Gemstone. Ultimately, a version of this plan, calling for surreptitious entry and bugging of Democratic National Committee headquarters in Washington, and later, if sufficient funds were available, penetration of the headquarters of Democratic presidential contenders and the Democratic convention facilities in Miami, was executed with the Watergate break-in on May 28, 1972. Other intelligence activities were directly undertaken by members of the White House staff during the period of the first Nixon administration. These operations included electronic surveillance matters, monitoring and investigating the behavior of Senator Edward Kennedy, Democrat, Massachusetts, and Dr. Daniel Ellsberg, with a view to causing them public discredit, burglarizing and possibly damaging the Brookings Institution, and probing individuals both within and outside of the government in a clandestine manner to determine their involvement in the disclosure of a memorandum written by ITT lobbyist Dita Beard. Columnist Jack Anderson had alleged that a $400,000 contribution to the Nixon campaign was linked by the document to a favorable ruling by the Justice Department on ITT's antitrust difficulties. In addition, White House staff, in pursuit of political intelligence, enlisted the assistance of certain government agencies. These actions resulted in what has been described as attempts to abuse governmental process. Agencies utilized in this manner by White House personnel included the Internal Revenue Service, harassment of political enemies, identification of sensitive cases, and supplying privileged information from taxpayer returns, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, supplying derogatory information about individuals from raw investigative files, the Antitrust Division of the Justice Department, supplying sensitive or derogatory information about individuals or groups, the Secret Service, wiretaps, surveillance information, and sensitive political information, and the Federal Communication Commission, media harassment. This, in general, was an important part of the organization of the White House intelligence forces during the Nixon tenure in the presidency. A portion of it was lost with the arrest of the Watergate burglars. The remaining portion slowly crumbled with investigations into its existence and operations by Congress and federal prosecutors. This is Our Hidden History